Christian parenting.
Choosing Christian education for your children can be a great blessing, but it is not without its challenges. Grab a cup of coffee and let's talk.
Hi, my name is Ray Rienow. Welcome to Family Vision with my parents, Dr. Rob and Amy Rienow, strengthening families through practical, encouraging, and real conversations.
Well, hi. Welcome back to Family Vision. I hope that you are enjoying our conversation about education. It is something I am very passionate about, so it's easy for me to talk about this. But today, I want to just take a little time and do a deep dive into Christian schools. Last week, we talked about the pros and cons of public education, and I want to do that same kind of format as we talk about the pros and cons of Christian education. First of all, Rob and I have one thing in our journey. I've just been really convicted about teaching our children God's Word. And one thing that we see with the blessing in our nation of Christian education is that there are lots of schools out there that take that commitment very seriously. And when we talk about Christian education, I think it's really important to understand there's such a variety in this realm of Christian education, just like there is in public schools. And in fact, maybe some of you may not be aware, but over the past 20 years, there's been just an abundance of different types of Christian schools that have come on the scene. So, for example, I have family in Texas that attend a Veritas school, which is a completely different type of Christian education based on a classical model. And these schools are really doing their own thing. What I mean by that is they aren't even traditional Christian schools. Like, they're not necessarily having to follow the state mandates, unlike other Christian schools that are Christian but are under the certification of the state, and so therefore they have to follow more of the state mandates. And for example, like Common Core, if you are a Christian school in the state that I live in, Illinois, you are still bound to follow Common Core. You may add Christian doctrine in that, but you are restricted to follow some of these state guidelines. And I just want to say that up front because again, there's such a variety of things that we're talking about when we're talking about Christian schools. And I am, first of all for that. What I would love to see is more and more choices of education come on the scene. There was just a great analogy I heard one time about the idea of comparing education to a car. So we all drive different cars, right? And when we go shopping for a car, each of us are looking for different things. Me with a family of 7 kids, I'm looking probably for a very different kind of car than you might be looking for if you have 2 kids in your family, right? We want very different things. So you can imagine that if the government said, okay, there's going to be only one type of car, how hard would it be to come up with all the characteristics and the things that everybody wanted in one type of car? It would be virtually impossible, and there would cause all these arguments and complaints about what we needed in this one type of car. And that's, I think, part of the problem when it comes to government-run education is we see those types of arguments because we're all focused on one type of education, and therefore everyone argues about how they want that education or how they want that school to look to fit their needs. But the reality is we all have different needs. And so therefore, I am thrilled to see all sorts of other types of Christian education coming on the scene because I believe the more choices that we have, it is a better chance and opportunity for you as a parent to find the type of education that suits your needs and your family best. But specifically, let's talk about the pros and cons of Christian schools. First of all, like I've already referenced this, but one of the biggest pros of Christian education is that God is a part of your kids' everyday school experience. We don't have to check God at the door when we are putting our kids in a Christian school. They will be praying for our kids. They will be talking about God's word. They will be learning to memorize God's word. And so your kids get to have a much more integrated education in the sense that they typically are going to be teaching a Christian worldview. They are going to be including those elements that are not included when you're sending your kids to public school. The other thing I think goes less noticed is the value of the individual. And let me explain that. Sometimes it's easier to explain this with the opposite. I have several friends who've worked in public education, and there's one theme that I hear over and over, and that is that typically in public education, you have a lot of attention being spent or resources on the top part of the educational spectrum. So, I mean, kids who are in advanced classes or gifted, like there's a lot of energy that are put into those classes. There's also a lot of energy put into resources for kids who are struggling with learning disabilities or behavior problems. You have a lot of resources and money that go there as well. But the vast amount of kids in that middle spectrum, think of that middle C curve, really don't get that kind of attention. But instead, as the words of some of my friends that have been working in that system for a long time, they use the phrase kind of shuffled on through, because so many of the resources are going to the top end of the curve and the lower end of the curve. So I have perceived in Christian education that one of the biggest pros of Christian education is that mindset does not really exist in Christian education or in many of the schools that I have seen, in the sense that there's much more of that value and attention on every individual, because they're just simply not confined the same way with their resources as maybe a public school would be. So there is more of a sense of really giving all the kids in a class a similar education or similar attention and a sharing of resources among all the individuals in a class. And I really think that is a huge strength of Christian education. And right along with that is that teachers in a Christian school often have a similar commitment to their students in a Christian school. You may not be aware, but if you are teaching at a Christian school, you are most likely making a lot less money than a similar counterpart in a public school, and that's just the way it is. So therefore, when you see teachers who are committed to teaching in Christian schools, they often could be making a lot more money and have a lot more benefits if they were teaching in a public school. So the reason why they are teaching where they are is because they really believe in what they're doing. They really do care about the kids that they are serving. And I think that cannot be underestimated in any way. Just the value of teachers who have this vision of their job is not something that is just a job. It's more of a ministry to them than just being a teacher. And I have rarely seen Christian schools that don't have more of that sense of teachers kind of loving discipleship towards the students that are in their classroom. And finally, I think one of the biggest pros of Christian education is simply a like-minded community. Sometimes we act like that's a bad thing, but in reality, we need, and your kids need often, to feel like they're not crazy in their Christian beliefs. And we talk about diversity a lot in our culture, but we underestimate how important unity is, especially when it comes to teaching our children our worldview. So when you're in a Christian community, you're just around more like-minded people. And I just want to affirm that. That's a good thing. It's a good thing to have your kids in a community where they see other people believe the same things that they do. And I don't think as Christians we need to be ashamed of that in any way. And in fact, I think it's interesting that, in the local Christian high school that my kids attend, there are so many people who find their spouses there. And I have two of my kids are marrying people that they met in their local Christian high school. And I think that's wonderful. So again, a like-minded community is a huge pro of a Christian school. But let's talk a little bit about some of the cons of Christian education. And I think the first is pretty clear, and that's just expense. It frankly can be extremely expensive to send your kids to a Christian school. It's almost cost prohibitive for many families. I shouldn't say almost. It is cost prohibitive for many families. So the expense is certainly a con. And I just wanted to touch on that because, some people or some families, I totally affirm that they believe that's such a great environment for their kids, but then they often have to work two jobs or just come up with lots of extra ways for mom or dad to make extra money in order to afford that education. And I would say it is a con if your family is so spent and parents are so absent working in order to get their kids to be in that school. That can be a true negative because your time and your relationship with your kids needs to be your top priority. So if you're in a system where you can't see your kids at all because you have to work so much in order to get them into a Christian school, I think that is a con that really needs to be evaluated. Let me just share a little personally on that. Rob and I do believe in the value of education, and we have chosen to spend our limited resources on the education of our kids, whether it be homeschooling or putting them in what we call co-schools, like a glorified co-op, meaning that we're paying for some Christian teachers to help our homeschool kids one day a week. Well, that's an expense. All the things that we've chosen have cost us a lot more money than it would have cost us if we had chosen to put our kids into public schools. So evaluating that expense. Now, Rob and I have been able to do that and handle that expense through personal sacrifices, but we have not sacrificed time with our kids. So, for example, if you come into my home, you're not going to find a piece of furniture that wasn't a hand-me-down or bought off the IKEA what they call that section. It's like almost like it's too damaged for even IKEA to sell. Like I buy a lot of things there. So, I don't love having secondhand furniture, and I don't love having my house not as decorated as I would like it to be. But the reality is that's a sacrifice that I've had to make in order to prioritize the amount of money that I'm spending for my kids' education, because that's a bigger priority to me right now than being able to decorate my house the way I would like to. So again, the con is the expense. It's evaluating how you are handling that expense. And I would say that if it's the point where you can't spend time with your kids, then maybe you need to reconsider whether, can you pay for that education and still not sacrifice what's really important to you. But if there's minor sacrifices that you can make, like for me, IKEA furniture, I can deal with that. We've chosen to make that sacrifice. The other thing that I would say can be a con is simply the peer culture. Just because you are sending your kids to a Christian school where most likely you're going to find loving teachers and you are going to find a nurturing environment, most of the time from the faculty. Obviously, I can't speak for all Christian schools at all times, but I would say the majority of time you're going to find that from your faculty and your teachers. You really can't control peer culture. And we have seen this time and again. Kids are kids. Adults are adults as well. So I don't necessarily think that we can just say, some of the things that we talk about with kids' problems, like, for example, maybe your child is in a class where there is a clique of kids that your child is feeling very excluded from and on the outside. Well, that can happen in public school. That can happen in Christian school. That can happen in a homeschool co-op. That can happen in a church with adults where adults feel left out of the cool clique in their adult community class. So, but why that's such a con, I believe, in Christian education is that can be really difficult when your kid's in an environment where they're talking all the time about how important it is to love each other, but yet they're daily feeling rejected, hurt, maybe even bullied, then that is something I think as a parent we really need to be aware of, because I have seen many times a bitterness sink into kids that are in Christian education because they've had so many negative experiences and they've come in these Christian environments. And that is very conflicting, and that can often, if it's not really dealt with directly, really give them a bad taste towards church and a bad taste towards God. So your eyes should be open to that. Don't just assume that because it's a wonderful Christian school, if for some reason your kid is in a class where they are not connecting, they are having these relationship problems or problems with their peer culture, then it may not be the best option for your kids. So pay attention to that. And along with that, I would say another con we see in Christian education is just simply limited class size and limited opportunities at times. You can't really, that stems a lot of different things, whether it's just what the school is offering, especially at the upper levels of high school. You know, if you have a child that's got some very specific interests that would be much more suited in a public school where they have more classes or more opportunities or more variety of things, but just it's not offered at a school that has limited resources, that's another thing to pay attention to. And I would say that applies socially as well. And this is what I mean by that. You know, the smaller a class, it's just harder to sometimes find like-minded people. So, for example, if my son, who was in the homeschool community, you might be unaware of some of these things, but in the homeschool community, there aren't as many kids that are really into sports. And when he was in high school, he had great friends in his homeschool community, but they were not into sports. They were into debate club and classical music and things that he just had no interest in. So while he really enjoyed these friendships, he really needed to be with kids that shared his interest. That's just normal. So often that can be a con that you want to be aware of, that if your kid is in a smaller Christian school, but they're not finding like-minded community, it's not like people are treating them poorly, but maybe they just need friends that share their interests, you might need to get creative about how you're going to help your student find more like-minded friendships and more like-minded, I shouldn't say not necessarily friendships, but like-minded kids that share some of their interests. So those to me, I think, are some of the, I'm sure there are other things that we could talk about, but those three really stand out to me as just some cons to be looking at if you're putting your kids into Christian education. And just in conclusion, we are going to be taking another deep dive in our next episode about the pros and cons of homeschooling. But again, the whole point of this series is to get your mind percolating and thinking about the fact that you have a lot of power as a parent to help guide your child's education. So my goal in this is just keep your eyes open, be aware of the pros and cons that might be ahead of you in the path that you have chosen. Well, thank you for joining me on Family Vision. You can connect with us at visionaryfam.com or on Facebook, and at Instagram, I'm at Amy at VFM. And please also check out my book, Not So Perfect Mom, Learning to Embrace What Matters Most, because in there I take a lot more in-depth dive on building those relationships with our children, which is one of the most important gifts that we can give our kids. I hope this information is helpful, and I hope that Family Vision is helpful. And please join us next time for the next episode of Family Vision.